This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Welcome to the third annual Lawrence Eitner Lecture on Ancient Art and Culture, an event meant to advertise and promote classics on this campus and beyond, made possible by the generous support of Peter and Lindsay Joost, great friends and supporters of Stanford Classics. It's a great pleasure to welcome Peter here tonight. The series is named in honor of Professor Lawrence Eitner, who, as it happens, died just a few weeks ago on March 11th at the age of 89. He is well known on campus as a very long-time director of the Stanford Art Museum, what is now the Cantor Center, which he ran for almost 30 years from the early 1960s to 1989. He was a renowned scholar, inspiring teacher, and really turned the art museum around. We are very lucky today to have a long-time friend and companion here, Sven Brunchen, who worked with him for quite a number of years. And I would like to ask him to say a few words about Lawrence Eitner.
That light is very. Thank you very much, Walter. I'm not so used to the Hollywood lighting, but anyway, I would first like to, as Walter did, thank Lindsay and Peter just for this wonderful opportunity to have these lectures. They began with John Boardman 3 years ago and continue tonight with Tony Grafton from Princeton. And not only are they advocating support for the classics department, but being an ex-art history student, I have to say that this is bringing something to art history also. And Jody Maxson from the art history department is seated over there. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to get both of these departments together under the auspices of the Lawrence Eitner Lecture Series. Lawrence was a dear friend. I did my dissertation with him many years ago. I worked with him at what was then the Stanford Museum. It is now the Cantor Art Center. I think Mrs. Stanford wouldn't like that, but we won't go into that designation. Anyway, Lawrence was an exceptional person in that he was a great museum director, a great scholar, a great teacher. When he took over the museum at Stanford in the early 1960s, it's about the time that I came out to Stanford, he walked into the museum and there was a large stump in the lobby with a rather tattered 1920s label on it that said, "Art is everywhere, even in nature." Well, he promptly got rid of that, as well as shifting the locomotive, which was located in one of the rotunda of the museum, and began work establishing what I would say is probably one of the best academic institutional museums on the West Coast. He was a wonderful organizer of exhibitions on a low budget. He was able to assemble things for a few $1,000s rather than a few $100,000. He bought very wisely. Of course, it was a time when one could make great acquisitions and not pay very much money for them. And Lawrence had astonishingly good taste, was able to buy wonderful material, particularly in the area of drawings and prints. Furthermore, when he organized exhibitions, he was one of the first people to do a thematic exhibition and put everything together. So he put prints, sculpture, paintings, drawings all together. The more traditional approach was to have a paintings exhibition or a drawings exhibition, but he managed to take all of these things, put them together, and organize a wonderful, academically oriented exhibition. And they were very successful, both at the museum and the art gallery. He managed to get students involved. There were seminars in the museum, seminars in the art gallery, and there was a great spirit in the department when I was there. Furthermore, he brought the department to number 6 in the country. I don't want to say anything disparaging, but I don't think it has a rating today. And he was a fantastic, as I mentioned, fantastic museum organizer. and autocratic leader, an enlightened autocrat in the old tradition, which is sometimes needed. And he did not suffer fools nor committees. He was someone that was extremely interested in the individual object. In fact, I mentioned just recently that Lawrence would carry Greek coins in his pocket, and if you started talking about connoisseurship, he'd pull them out of his pocket and talk about the sculptural qualities of Athenian coins. And so he had this marvelous capacity to be interested and in love with the object. Furthermore, he was a great scholar. His many books on Jericho, as well as his fabulous survey of 19th century art, which I believe is still in print, was a great contribution to art history. He came out of a second generation of the European-American art scholarship with people like, well, he was actually one generation later than people like Witkover and Erwin Panofsky, the great German scholar. But again, Lawrence had that European background, a number of languages, having studied both in Europe and in America. He received his PhD from Princeton, came out to Stanford in the early 60s, as I mentioned, was director of the museum for 30 years, head of the department for 30 years. He didn't like revolving chairmanships. He thought he could do more, and he did, just staying on and building the department. During that time, he was offered the directorship of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He turned that down. He was offered the directorships of the Princeton Art Museum and the Minneapolis Art Institute, both of which, again, he turned down. For his continuous service to the world of art, he was offered the Emeritus Cross of the Austrian government in 1990, and he was a member of the American Academy. And also he served for a number of years as the head of the program at Clifton, the Stanford program at Clifton. So I could go on and on about this remarkable man, but we have another remarkable man to consider. So I just wanted to say a few words of appreciation, and on behalf of the Eitner family, who I'm in touch with, our thanks.
The task of introducing Anthony Grafton is, of course, both an honor and a pleasure, but it is also unenviable. To those who don't know the man already, it is impossible to do justice to the importance, breadth, and sheer verve of his scholarship. To those that do, it is impossible to avoid tired superlatives or match the skill of the last person I happen to have heard introducing him on this very campus. In either case, can I justify my irritation value in keeping a great speaker from an eager audience? So let me keep this short and sweet. Professor Grafton comes to us from Princeton, where he has taught since 1975, latterly as the Henry Putnam Professor of History. Though born and raised in New York, he began his formal studies at the University of Chicago and ended them there in short order with a degree of PhD. Along the way, he spent some time at University College London, where he worked with the very influential scholar Arnaldo Momigliano. The awards he has received are simply too many to mention here. The fields he has made his own since that time have been the history of scholarship and education in the West from antiquity to the 19th century, the history of science from antiquity to the Renaissance, the cultural history of Renaissance Europe, and the history of books and readers. He made his name with an imposing intellectual biography of Joseph Scaliger, the 16th century French classicist and historian. As in the later major books on Leon Battista Alberti and Girolamo Cardano, the past comes to life when viewed through the eyes of someone learned, interesting, and unusual. One particular favorite, the footnote, A Curious History, shows Professor Grafton's range from antiquity to the digital present, and a knack of presenting highly technical material in engaging and sometimes humorous ways. The essay genre has been especially fertile ground, reaching a wide audience. If one tallies some 10 single-authored books, to say nothing of another 9 co-edits, on my recent count, one would be forgiven for wondering if there have been several Anthony Graftons in action for some decades, some 4 decades. No corner of intellectual history, ancient or otherwise, has been too obscure or too immune from comparison. No detail too small, no question too big. I find it no accident that the new collection of essays, Worlds Made by Words, Scholarship and Community in the Modern West, highlights the convivial and shared aspects of intellectual culture, something that has too often been perceived as and has, in our own times, too easily become a solitary and individual exercise. It is easy to see why Tony has earned respect and affection at his own university while never ceasing to be a distinguished citizen of an international republic of letters. Here is a highly productive scholar who is also a passionate teacher. From my own point of view, it is a quality of human empathy that informs Professor Grafton's work at every turn. Whether making sense of the most eccentrically learned Renaissance scholars or coaxing a paper out of a self-discombobulating student. One gloomy New Jersey winter's day, he passed on the following advice that had come originally from his wife's experience as an elementary school teacher. Show them that you care and take the class outside whenever you can. The late Professor Eitner, a 1952 PhD from the same institution in New Jersey, would surely have been delighted that the 2009 Eitner lecture will be given by Tony Grafton on the topic Encountering Antiquity in Renaissance Europe, Greeks, Jews, and Humanists. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's an enormous honor to give the third Eitner lecture. It has been very gratifying to learn about and to enjoy the extraordinary beneficence and hospitality of the Justs, a couple who remind me more of some of the Maecenases I study in the 15th and 16th centuries than of many of my contemporaries, and very, very pleasant to meet them. And many thanks to Grant Parker, old friend who studied with me many years ago, and many thanks to you for allowing a non-classical cuckoo into a classical nest. I should say that I am an ex-classicist. It's true. Sternuit ad probationem. I am an ex-classicist, you know, the ex-parrot in Monty Python. I did mean to be a classicist and started as one, but somehow I took a wrong turn one day and wound up doing what we now call reception. At the classics department at Princeton, which is very much a classics department, trot me out when someone wants to read really strange texts. Grant wanted to read, as I recall, Polyphetus and other people like that. So we read them together in a gloomy New Jersey winter many years ago, and I'm deeply grateful for his friendship ever since. The characters of Theophrastus was just the sort of gorgeous torso, or indeed herm, that Renaissance humanists loved to attack with philological hammers and chisels. The author, who was Aristotle's star pupil and became his successor, composed this lively set of character sketches for unknown reasons at an uncertain date. The figures Theophrastus describes, all of whom exemplify bad qualities, seem to have stepped out of the cartoons of an Athenian James Thurber. They include the toady, who laughs so hard at a great man's jokes that he has to stuff his cloak in his mouth to stop himself from giggling. The superstitious man who won't approach a tombstone, pass or a pregnant woman or a corpse, or pass a crossroads without making a libation. The chatterbox, a favorite of mine, who is as likely to tell you, "I threw up yesterday," as to give you the price of wheat, and doesn't care if either fact interests you very much. And finally, that weapon of mass destruction, the talker, whose logorrhea menaces the entire city. On a jury, he prevents others from reaching a verdict. At the theater, he prevents them from watching the show. At dinner, he prevents them from getting on with their meal. As so often, a very ancient text turns out, like the Mad Gardener's rattlesnake in Lewis Carroll, to be the middle of next week, or at least to be this weekend's faculty dinner party. The characters offered readers a mordant vision of language and social life, subjects of central interest to the humanists, cast in the neat, swallowable form of profiles. It also swarmed with information about urban life in ancient Athens, a subject of equal interest to the antiquarians who had rediscovered some of the lost beauties of the ancient city, and the possibilities of writing a history that offered not a narrative, but a diachronic recreation of buildings, practices, rituals, and institutions. Most alluring of all, it was pocked with indecipherable phrases, as indeed it still is. These posed the sort of challenge to ingenuity and erudition that all card-carrying humanists prized. Isaac Cos Alban, the indefatigable Huguenot Hellenist who lived from 1559 to 1614, was just the sort of humanist on whom this sort of text acted like catnip on a cat. In the Greek text, and I'm going to invite you to watch him work with me just for a moment. In the Greek text in Latin translation, published by the scholar-printer Frédéric Morel in 1583, Theophrastus describes the boastful man as follows. He stands in the diazogma and tells foreigners how much money he has invested at sea, and he explains how big his money-lending business is and how much he himself has gained and lost. Reading this, Cos Alban asked one simple but vital question. What is he actually calling a diazogma? He had every reason to wonder. Though Morel printed the Greek word in his text, he evidently had not a clue what it meant, at least in this context, for instead of translating it, he transliterated it in his Latin version. When he tried to explain it in a marginal note, he lunged in every direction, less like a respectable commentator than the proverbial cow caught in barbed wire. It seems to be some kind of gap or transverse beam on a bridge or the port or the vestibule of a building. Cos Alban thought a few things were clear in all this murk. Theophrastus must have brought this imaginary braggart on stage in some public place at Athens where meetings used to take place. A chorus in Aristophanes' Nights mentioned the degma, and a note in the Greek Scholia on Aristophanes explained that the term referred to exactly the sort of public place Cos Alban had in mind. The degma is a place in the Piraeus where many foreigners and citizens met and told stories. I think Cos Alban concluded, quoting this in his note, that the passage must be corrupt, and I read degmati, for the degma was this place in the Piraeus. The fact that the scholium mentioned foreigners clinched his case. Theophrastus's braggart spends his time exactly explaining his business to foreigners. As amended, the whole passage becomes a vivid, concrete description of a boastful man standing in the market in the Piraeus, exactly as Antonio stands on the Rialto in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, also telling strangers about what should have remained his private business. So Cos Alban's edition of the characters, which coruscates with philological gems like this, each deserving to be picked up and inspected from multiple facets, but we won't, also displays an extraordinary ability at conjectural emendation. Most important of all, though, it shows Cos Alban thinking in a richly historical way about a difficult ancient book. Again and again, Cos Alban explains to readers that the examples contained in this book are not just made up by the author, they come from everyday Athenian life. And again, he mobilized his extraordinary erudition to prove this point. His copy of the Scholia on Aristophanes, for example, remains in the British Library, and he's worked through it from beginning to end, collating the Scholia against Theophrastus and drawing much wonderful information from it. This little bit of work by Cos Alban, and there are many comparable samples in his career, exemplifies for me the technical side of humanism as the great art historian Erwin Panofsky defined that movement more than half a century ago. Panofsky argued, as you'll recall, that the artists of the Renaissance had devised a new system of one-point perspective, which enabled them to take a fixed distance from an object and portray it in a way that made it convincingly stand out, as if it were in 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. In the same way, he argued, the humanists and antiquarians of the Renaissance learned how to see the ancient world from a fixed distance in time. They, the antiquaries, the advanced artists who sometimes worked with them, used this new ability to fix a chronological standpoint, to see the ancient world as a whole and a unified whole, to reunite classical forms with classical content, to revive classical visions of classical authors, as Fulvio Orsini did in his famous Images of Illustrious Men, not only for Homer, but also for Theophrastus. We draw the curtain of charity over the identification of the Herm I showed you first with Theophrastus. By 16th century standards, it was a very clever idea. Well, I've come today not to bury Panofsky, but to qualify him a little bit. I believe that, as the example of Cos Alban's work on Theophrastus suggests, Panofsky put his finger on something central about Renaissance humanism, that shock of recognition that the ancients lived in a world coherently different from one's own, a world that the scholar had to reassemble like a mosaic. But I think that the experience of the humanists was in fact more layered, more complicated, and sometimes more contradictory than Panofsky actually expressed, that it involved more kinds of work with more kinds of text and sometimes with more kinds of informant that Panofsky realized. And what I'm going to try to do with Cos Alban and his great friend Joseph Scaliger is to use some of the new methods of intellectual history to put them back in their world and suggest some of the more complicated ways in which they looked from that world back to an ancient one. Now, it's never easy to connect a scholar, a technical scholar like Cos Alban, with a wider historical context. Doing so, you always risk, as you do when you connect a mathematician or a physicist with a context, imposing your protagonist in an iron cage of bad analogies. And that's been a problem that people interested in Cos Alban have always faced. Mark Patterson's magnificent biography of him, first published in 1875, still perhaps the most powerful and readable book ever written about one of the great Renaissance humanists, faced this problem squarely. Patterson tells Cos Alban's life story, follows him on the trail from modest academic beginnings in Geneva to his last position, which I will describe in a little while, a much grander one, and finally concentrates on the great difficulty of expressing or indeed explaining what Cos Alban thought he was doing. For Patterson, mesmerized, I've gone to the next scholar. Patterson, mesmerized as a young writer by Cos Alban's diary, saw him in the end as a tragic figure who had driven himself to despair, vainly trying to master an infinite universe of knowledge in a finite lifetime. Now, one can see, reading the diary, why you would draw this conclusion, just as one might draw such a conclusion from our emails. But I hope you'll agree with me that the conclusion from the emails would be premature and partial. You know, when you read Cos Alban tormenting himself with guilt, "I rose at 5, he says one day in 1597, alas, how late." When you see him torturing himself over pleasant conversations which robbed him of working time, amici inimici, he says more than once. And you then learn that he wrote some 20 books in folio, produced some 22 children, 19 of whom survived childbirth, wrote some 2,500 letters in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. You might be convinced that Patterson was right and that this was someone who simply couldn't bear the load of guilt that even this productivity left with him, someone whose work as a scholar and emotional life were somehow always at odds with one another. No one who's read Patterson's book can ever forget the account of his autopsy carried out by the distinguished Dr. Théodore Touquet de Mayerne, who found that Cos Alban's bladder had become malformed and full of mucus calculus matter. The malformation, he says, was congenital, but it was aggravated by sedentary habits and inattention to the calls of nature while the mind of the student was absorbed in study. Cos Alban emerges as a kind of Protestant counterpart to the Baroque saints of the same period, who suffered similar pains as they made the mystical ascent rather than the scholarly descent. Cos Alban's other partners in philological activity have also been hard to tie to context. Consider his great older contemporary Joseph Scaliger, who lived from 1540 to 1609, edited many Latin poets, and recreated in two extraordinary books the entire historical tradition and history of the ancient world, from its beginnings in ancient Egypt down to the fall of the Roman Empire. The man who is only one of his extraordinary services discovered and published what we now call the Canon of Kings, Babylonian, Persian, and later, which remains an absolute cornerstone document for all of ancient history, but which mentioned a number of people not attested in any Greek or Latin source other than the Canon, a text which Scaliger could easily have dismissed as a forgery, but didn't. If Cos Alban's been taken always as a self-torturer, someone whose work did nothing to assuage his feelings of guilt or to make him feel as if he labored in a proper vocation, Scaliger has always been seen as the aristocrat who was free of any context. Jakob Bernays, the great German scholar who wrote his biography, tells us with absolute credulity how Scaliger learned Greek, not by anything so pedestrian as reading actual grammar, but by reading Homer in 3 weeks from end to end, compiling his own grammar of Homeric Greek as he worked. He taught himself many other languages, supposedly in the same way, and over time, despite having to fight in the French wars of religion, made himself a sovereign Greek scholar who owed nothing to his time or place, one so sovereign that in his late 60s he could translate Martial into Greek lying in bed, memorize the entire translation, and then write it out one day as a whole. So here we have two different models, but each of them is a model in which the scholar and the context are pretty dissociated, and in which the conquest of antiquity, though clear, is hard to tie to a larger world. Well, these two Hellenists corresponded with one another in long, frank letters over a period of 15 years. They also left rich information in many forms about the way in which they thought about the ancient world, the scholarly tools they applied to it, and the kinds of dialogue they engaged in, not only with one another, but with other informants. By examining some of these, I hope to show, we can, in fact, do some of the contextualizing that these men in their enterprise have lacked. The first thing to realize is that both men were readers in a 16th century period sense, only represented by certain eccentrics in the current age of the hot link and the power skim. The humanist of the 16th century, overwhelmed by floods of books and information that washed into their studies in new languages, from new continents, from new sources, always read pen in hand, bent nib raised to protect himself from the overwhelming tide of new material. They read with equipment designed to foster strenuous attentiveness and easy comparison of multiple sources. They prepared themselves morally and aesthetically for the task of reading. Machiavelli, as you all know, would play cards all day in the inn and then go home, wash, dress himself in royal robes, and to dress himself to the ancients, asking them questions, and they in their humanity would answer. Cos Alban tells us at least that he always combed his hair before he went to his study to read. And as to Scaliger, he made reading one of his miraculous accomplishments. He read in bed, a 16th century four-poster bed with a curtain without a candle. Light came out of his eyes, he assures us, and shone on the page. Such men made reading into a kind of discipline that we now might find hard to imagine. They wreathed their copies of books with annotations, as we will see. They compiled enormous notebooks of the most varied kinds. On the left, you see one of Cos Alban's textual notebooks. On the right, a ghost story that Archbishop Lancelot Andrews of Ely told him and that he carefully took down and put in the same kind of notebooks. They classified their information. They made what some modern historians have I think, succumbed to the modern period temptation of calling databases. What they did, I will argue, is something rather different. They created what I like to call a web that they wove, a vast web of annotation and written response that began in margins, moved into notebooks, and extended itself into their letters, as well into drafts, into fragmentary treatises, as well as into books never published. Only by reweaving the web, by putting the publications in the context of these larger and very difficult to describe activities, can we actually see how they saw themselves and saw the ancient world. And when we do this, and when we let the strands of the web lead us, we make many unexpected discoveries. This is a small notebook which Cos Alban bound into one of his working copies of Theophrastus. There's nothing surprising about the bibliographical note in Latin on the top right, but there's something a little unusual about the note on the top left. It's in Hebrew, not a language you'd expect to find in a set of notes on Theophrastus, the Athenian writer. It says, Shavach le'el borei olam, praise be to God, creator of the universe. Borei, the word for create, is misspelled. Cos Alban's Hebrew was very, very fluent, but he worked very quickly and he made mistakes he would never have made in Greek or Latin. What I and a collaborator working on Cos Alban have found, what I have found alone in working with Scaliger, is that one of the discoveries you make when you trace their web is that a Jewish element exists in unexpected as well as expected places. An element sometimes couched in Hebrew or Aramaic, sometimes in Greek, one that's unexpectedly rich and prominent. If you reconstruct Cos Alban's Hebrew library, which we did by the simple expedient of examining every book printed in Hebrew in the British Library, which includes the Old Royal Library, which took in Cos Alban's books before 1614, it turns out that he had the richest Hebrew library in Britain at the time of his death, something which none of his students has managed to tell us. And this was so forgotten that in the 19th century, when his copy of David Kimche's grammar, the Book of Perfection, Sefer Michlol, appeared in the British Library, the scholar who found it interpreted the signature at the bottom of the page as the signature of an otherwise unknown rabbi, Rabbi Yitzhak Kazuban. In fact, it's a major strand in his work. As to Scaliger, there's never been any question. He collected an extraordinary range of what he called Oriental books, or books in Oriental languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and others. These were incorporated, thanks to his bequest, in what the University of Leiden Library called its Ark, which you see on the right. The most special collection in the university library. You can see even the dog looking impressed as he looks up at it. An extraordinary collection, so extraordinary in fact that the librarians pasted the slips identifying books as belonging to Scaliger's legacy into a great many books that actually had nothing to do with Scaliger. But the collection was rich enough for all that, including everything from a magnificent illuminated printed Hebrew Bible to the Jerusalem Talmud, of which he owned the actual main manuscript, as well as a printed edition from the shop of Bomberg. So these two men are dedicated buyers of Hebrew. More impressive, they're dedicated readers. They began with texts of the Bible. When you studied Latin or Greek in the Renaissance, you began with short texts, which were printed so as to give you plenty of space to annotate, to parse, to take apart, to record meanings. Hebrew texts were printed in the same way. This is the book of Hosea, a prophetic book of the Bible, quite a short one, printed for students at an intermediate stage, and as you see, covered with Cos Alban's annotations. A couple of his printed books are so heavily annotated that the Bodleian classes them as manuscripts rather than printed books. When Cos Alban really wanted to force a text into his head in any language, he didn't content himself with reading it, he wrote it. As he recalled, Demosthenes had copied out Thucydides 8 times, so he copied out the considerably shorter biblical book of Esther 8 times, annotating it as he went, forcing it into his memory. Scaliger did similar things, working his way, as many Christian Hebraists did, through the Hebrew text of the Gospel of Matthew. Here you see that when Scaliger mastered Hebrew, and in this case Aramaic and Syriac, he used grammars. This is Jean Mercier's Aramaic grammar. This is the distinguished Italian humanist Angelo Canini's effort to sort out the different forms of Aramaic and of Syriac. And here you see a very young Scaliger proudly signing his name in multiple languages and showing off. So this gives you a sense of the investment which Scaliger as well as Cos Alban made in these languages. Early in their careers, both men expected the study of Hebrew to pay off with wonders. Guillaume Postell, manuscript collector, linguist, and wanderer, convinced Scaliger when the two of them lived together for a few days in a printer's house in Paris. So Scaliger later recalled that the Eastern languages contained great mysteries which Scaliger would learn by mastering the tongues. Cos Alban learned rabbinical Hebrew, as he confided to a friend, in the hope of taking an adventurous trip to the Eastern Mediterranean, where he would use it as a lingua franca, while discovering even rarer books in Arabic. Scaliger didn't find the mysteries. Cos Alban never made it to the Mediterranean. Nonetheless, the ambitions give you a sense of the scale of their plans. Over time, however, both of them veered from the Kabbalistic or magical side of Hebrew studies to a much more philological level. On the left, you see a note in which Cos Alban condemns the practices very popular in the Jewish tradition and very, very popular among Christian Hebraists of interpreting biblical texts not through their semantic meanings, but by, for example, treating the letters as numbers and interpreting their numerical values or finding rules for substituting one letter for another. Cos Alban condemns the process on the left, drawing on an argument from Scaliger's book, which I show you in the right. So the two of them really argue for a kind of philological approach to Hebrew rather than a mystical one. Neither of them was contented with the Bible. Like all good Christian Hebraists, they read Maimonides, whose Mishneh Torah you see here on the left in a Venice edition. Cos Alban's notes show him appreciating not just the content of the text, but its particular Jewish aesthetic. He calls this a beautiful title page in the manner of the Jews. And he also calls attention, if you see in this niche in the triumphal arch, you see the proverb, from Moses to Moses, from Moses to Moses, Maimonides, there arose no one like Moses. He calls attention to this as well. So Cos Alban was not just a Hellenist, but a kind of Hebrew bibliophile, steeped in Jewish books and fascinated by their manner of production. Both men read a kind of Hebrew book that you really might not expect to find a Christian Hebraist reading, prayer books. This is a list of Scaliger's Oriental books made after his death, and as you see, it included what the list maker, Bonaventura Vulcanius, called a splendid volume containing hymns and all the other things that Jews sing in the synagogue. Cos Alban owned several Hebrew prayer books. On the left, you see him doing one of his favorite things when reading Hebrew, translating into Greek as he goes, line by line. On the right, at the bottom, you see him doing the other thing he likes to do with Hebrew prayers, wondering about them. Why, he wonders, does an Orthodox Jewish male thank God for not making him a woman? Sometimes the prayers baffled him. The prayer of thanks for giving one all necessary orifices was one that Cos Alban found impossible to believe existed, much less to compute. But one kind of Jewish prayer fascinated him and called out all his admiration, the slichot, the prayers for forgiveness from the day of repentance. As a Calvinist laden with guilt for all the time he wasted, Cos Alban felt a deep kind of Wahlverwandtschaft with the Jews, who clearly felt exactly the same way. Cos Alban and Scaliger's reading went into more obscure corners than that. This is the beginning note. Cos Alban often puts in a single note in a book to single out what he thinks is most important about it. In his copy of Sefer Hasidim, a book that both he and Scaliger owned copies of. This is a medieval text which describes the practices and beliefs and rules of Jewish life in medieval Ashkenaz. Scaliger didn't think much of it, and Cos Alban professed to agree with him in a diplomatic letter. In fact, though, as Cos Alban's note says, he found the book quite gripping. He was particularly fascinated, as he says, by the fact that the book is full of descriptions of Jewish scribal culture, terms for books, terms for scribes, terms for writing implements. And he found more in the book than technical information. Sefer Hasidim, as scholars have discovered in the last 20 years or so, is one of the most informative sources we have for the lives and roles of women in the medieval Ashkenazic world, and shows, among other things, that they had much to do with the trade for books. At one point, the book tells a fabulous story. A Jewish woman, angry with her husband because he refuses to buy books, as a good Jewish husband would, refuses in her turn to go to the ritual bath, thus preventing him from having sex with her. Lysistrata in the shtetl, you could say. Cos Alban was a passionate book buyer, as passionate as any yeshiva bocher. He was also as dependent a husband as any yeshiva bocher. Cos Alban, you see, was a sucker for any handsome young Protestant with a sob story, and even a bigger sucker for any handsome book that he saw in the bookstalls around St. Paul's. Near the end of his life, May 19, 1611, he writes in his diary, "Today I paid the booksellers what I owed, except for Norton, to whom I owe the most. I've emptied my purse. Today I decided that until Madame Cos Alban comes home, I will not spend more than a gold sovereign on books, unless something truly rare should turn up." No wonder, one thinks, that when Cos Alban read the tale of the Jewish wife who insisted that her husband buy more books, he wrote pulcherrima historia in the margin. He saw something of himself, or something perhaps of Madame Cos Alban in the Jewish wife. Both Scaliger and Cos Alban learned to write Hebrew as well as to read it. When Scaliger decided he needed information about books from the Samaritan community in Palestine, he wrote them a letter in Hebrew, of which this is a draft. And when Cos Alban received a letter, which you see on the left, from a Jewish convert who taught in Germany, he replied in a fluent and handsomely written Hebrew letter. You can see his signature, Yitzhak Cos Alban. There's Rabbi Cos Alban, down at the very bottom of the page. So this was, of course, a standard humanist tact for mastering a language. Martin Crusius, the great humanist of Tübingen who taught Johannes Kepler Greek, kept his hand in with Greek by translating the sermons that he listened to into Greek as he listened to them. 9,000 of these translations survive, should anyone be looking for a dissertation topic in Renaissance Hellenism. Cos Alban and Scaliger didn't write as much Hebrew as they did Greek, but their accomplishments are still quite impressive. They also read the work of Christian Hebraists, and as we pursue them into creative scholarship, the lessons of this engagement about their vision of the past will begin to emerge. The first one is that they applied the same methods to classical and to Jewish texts, whether the Jewish texts were ancient or modern. Both Scaliger and Cos Alban deeply admired Johannes Buxtorf, professor in Basel, expert Hebraist, and author of the Judenschule, the first detailed treatment of the lives of Ashkenazic Jews, which appeared in 1603. No cuddly Philo-Semite, Buxtorf does his best in describing the whole life cycle of an Ashkenazic Jew from birth to death in magnificent detail to prove that these Jews were sunk in folly and superstition. They say they know God, but belie it by their works, since they are those whom God abominates. It's an interesting approach to ethnography. Scaliger remarked, it's remarkable that the Jews talk to Buxtorf, given how he speaks about them in his book. Yet both men knew that they couldn't rival Buxtorf for direct knowledge of Jewish life. This is Cos Alban's copy of the Judenschule. If you look at the top right of the title page, you will see that he calls attention to the fact that Buxtorf was directly acquainted with rabbis and even partied with them. Below that, he lists page by page every passage in which he thought that Buxtorf was describing Jewish life not from textual but from personal information, from autopsy or from an account actually given to him by a Jew. What Buxtorf didn't say, but what Cos Alban had rightly inferred, was that Buxtorf did in fact spend much time talking to the Jews whose stubbornness in persisting in their religion he disliked so much. Buxtorf's notebook survives in Basel, and at the bottom of this page you see him giving an account of how when a Jew toasts a Christian at a wedding and says, L'chaim tovim, good life, he's actually giving you a curse by manipulating the numerical value of the letters. And Buxtorf actually records that I learned this from a Jew on the 29th of May in 1600 in the village of Altschwiller. So this, though it's a very negative ethnography, it's ethnography carried out at a very high level of precision by the standards of the 16th or, sadly, even the 20th century. My favorite of these passages is the one in which Buxtorf, dignified Basel professor, describes his conversation with a Jew named Jakob Sephorimträger, Jacob the Bookschlepper, as a sort of character out of Joseph Epstein's short stories, Fabulous Little Jews, and whom Buxtorf seems to have liked a little better. He doesn't give any poisonous information from this. What's remarkable is that Cos Alban knew how to read ethnography because he was so good a Hellenist. It was by reading Herodotus, whose work both Scaliger and Cos Alban read long before they read Buxtorf, that Scaliger and Cos Alban learned to read for autopsy and personal information when reading a modern ethnography. Here you see the notes that Scaliger took on Herodotus in his 20s. They appear in the very beginning of his copy of the book, which is still in the Cambridge University Library. When Cos Alban followed Herodotus to Egypt, he noted every conversation in which Herodotus mentioned getting information from the priests of Thebes or the inhabitants of Memphis. When Scaliger encountered the passage in which Herodotus mentioned that he couldn't give the number of how many Scythians they were because their accounts disagreed, Scaliger wrote, Herodotus was in Scythia. Again, we draw the curtain not of charity but of prudence over discussing what Herodotus knew about Scythia. What's important here is that in an age of travel accounts and ethnography, an age in which the book market was flooded with accounts of the New World, accounts of China, accounts of Persia, accounts of the other within, the Jew, it was as classical scholars that Cos Alban and Scaliger responded to this flood of information. The humanistic discipline, as they understood it, was what enabled them to cope with a flood of non-humanistic information. So that's a first bit of thinking about past and present, which doesn't emerge from Panofsky's paradigm. But the unity of classical and biblical, of Greek and Jewish scholarship comes out most starkly in the technical work that Cos Alban did. And here I am going to revise a starkly Panofskyan analysis, which I myself gave 25 years ago, a song of innocence about Cos Alban, and explain both why I was wrong and why one has to understand his work in a different way. The venerable character you see here is, of course, the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistos, thrice great Hermes, whose Greek works, read and revered and seen as diabolic in the Byzantine world, were brought to Italy in the 1450s, were seen, as they had been in Byzantium, as the genuine work of an Egyptian writer far older than any Greek writer, and were identified as the source from which Plato had drawn the core of his doctrines. Marsilio Ficino, great Greek scholar, stopped translating Plato at the direct request of his Mr. Jost Marsilio Cosimo de' Medici in order to translate the work of Hermes Trismegistus, which became a bestseller with a magnificent blurb from a printer's corrector saying, "Whoever you are, buy me, for I am Hermes Trismegistos, who astonished the barbarians and enlightened the Greeks, and I will give you a great deal of knowledge for a very small price." Hermes became a major figure in the intellectual firmament of 15th and 16th century Hellenists. He won places of honor, as here in the pavement of the Siena Cathedral, where he appears next to David, the author of the Psalms, and to the Sibyls. And like both of them, he earned a place in a work that played a central role in Cos Alban's life. The great church history of the Italian scholar Cesare Baronio, Vatican librarian and author of the first great effort to show that the church had never changed from antiquity to the present. This is Cos Alban's copy on the left, which survives in Dublin. It's a magnificent polemical work which argues that the church had sprung into being in the time of Jesus, as it still was in the age of the Counter-Reformation, with bishops, with the Mass, with the liturgy, all of them never changed. The kind of book to make a Protestant angry. And on the right, you see Cos Alban's note at the end of page 173 in the first volume, all that he managed to study in sufficient detail in order to refute the work. Though he did read the entire book, and it's his late marginalia that are really chilling. He basically says of Mary, Queen of Scots, it would take a heart of stone to read her death without laughing. Now, Baronio really is the kind of writer to enrage a Protestant. Here is the note that Jonathan Swift wrote after whiling away years of boredom in Dublin reading Baronio's Annales. Pessimus inter pessimos scriptores, falsissimus inter falsissimos, nugacissimus inter nugacissimos, insulsissimus inter insulsissimus. Thus, after reading the 12 volumes, I assessed this. Raging and bored. Jonathan Swift, 1729. Baronio provoked from Cos Alban the longest and nastiest book review in the entire poisoned history of literature. 800 folio pages of venom directed against the first 173 pages of Baronio's work. What matters from our standpoint, and what most of you know, is that this book contains the most famous philological argument Cos Alban ever made, the magnificent passage in which, in 10 pages of precise, detailed argument, he shows that the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistus cannot be Egyptian, cannot be ancient, cannot have anything to do with their purported authorship. It's the first great demolition of a Greek fake or pseudepigraphon as opposed to a Latin one carried out by a humanist. And it took a great deal of work. Poor Baronio, by the way, never really meant for Hermes Trismegistus to occupy a big part in his analysis. This is the manuscript of Baronio's book, which is in the Vatican Library. And if you look closely, you see that he added his reference to Mercurius Trismegistus at the last moment. I'm sure many of you, like me, have done this from time to time when writing an article and found that it's always a bad idea. Well, Baronio found exactly the same. For Cos Alban, spurred by this reference to Mercurius Trismegistus, obtained a copy of the book, read it in his usual thorough way, and immediately began to find anachronisms of every kind, references to Greeks who lived long after the time of Hermes Trismegistus, Phidias, for example, borrowings from Plato rather than texts that Plato had used. Worse still, he found features of the text that couldn't possibly come from an Egyptian original, as this text supposedly did. The Hermetic corpus says that the term cosmos is the right term for the world or the universe. Kosme gartapanta, it cosmizes everything. It puts everything in a beautiful order. All Cos Alban wrote in his copy was cosmos, but in his final text in which he attacks Baronio, he asks the crucial question, are cosmos and cosmeo words from the ancient Egyptian language? Obviously not. It's a brilliant piece of scholarly detective work, and even the scholars who in the 20th century have revived the argument that there are Egyptian elements to the Hermetic corpus have been unable to show that the texts as preserved are anything but Greek originals. So far, I made my way 25 years ago. What I didn't fully recognize was the extent to which Cos Alban's argument about a Greek text, Cos Alban's effort to discriminate, to rid the Greek corpus of a fake, was actually tied to his Hebrew philology and his interest in Jewish texts and Jewish sources. Cos Alban read no texts more eagerly or continually than the Hebrew prophets. His notes are full of discussions of the rhetoric of Isaiah and Jeremiah. He was certain that true prophecy was always difficult. And so when he came across a passage in Hermes Trismegistus where Hermes said, "This mystery has been concealed until this day when I reveal it," he became even more furious than usual. For as he says, note if this is true and this man wrote before Moses, then God revealed his mysteries, not through Moses, but through this man. Cos Alban, in other words, found most offensive in Hermes not the anachronistic references to Greeks, not the slips that showed that he was writing in Greek, but the claim to be a genuine pagan prophet. For Hermes, if he was a prophet, spoke more clearly than the Hebrew prophets. He was far too true to be good, and that was impossible. What I didn't realize 25 years ago, what I could have learned from Cos Alban's diary, quoted at the top, was that at the same time that he was reading Hermes and worrying about one kind of pagan prophecy, he was reading Christian Hebraists and worrying about another kind. Here he tells us that in June 1601, I spent some days with Galatinus and Reuchlin, and I'm not ashamed of the time that I spent in reading them, even though learned men have their great faults too. Reuchlin, of course, was the great Christian Kabbalist whose approach to Hebrew Cos Alban rejected, even though he admired his erudition. Galatinus meant much more to him. Pietro Galatino, Catholic priest and Hebraist, had brought out a massive book in 1518 on the secrets of Catholic truth. In it, he quoted a vast range of ancient texts, for such they were taken throughout the 16th century, many of them in Hebrew, many in Latin translation. Prophecies that he ascribed to rabbis who, he said, had predicted the truths of Christianity and the history of the Christian world with utmost clarity. One of them in particular infuriated Cos Alban. According to Galatino, one Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy rabbi, had predicted the coming of the Messiah, had predicted that in the 4th century, Constantine's mother Helen would discover the true cross in Palestine, had predicted the Christian doctrine of transubstantiation. In these notes which Cos Alban took on Galatino and Rabbeinu HaKadosh, you see Cos Alban saying, new guy, new guy, new guy. It's remarkable, it's more than remarkable how confidently Galatino shows himself when he cites this pseudo-rabbi who, he says, so many years before the birth of the Lord, prophesied so clearly about the mysteries of the faith. A letter to Scaliger, and here you have the last bit where the web comes together, a web of marginal notes, a web of reading notes, a web of correspondence, brings all the points together. In 1601, Cos Alban was reading Galatino. In 1603, he writes to Scaliger to ask what Scaliger thinks about that our holy rabbi, that Rabbinus HaKadosh, whom Galatino uses to prove that all the mysteries of Christianity, especially those of transubstantiation and all those bells and whistles, were known to the most ancient Jews. I, says Cos Alban, believe, for pretty serious reasons, that the quotations from this and similar ones from others are pseudepigrapha, no less than the texts of Trismegistus, which I will believe came from that very ancient Egyptian on the day when I declare my formal divorce from the art of criticism. Scaliger and Cos Alban corresponded at length about forgeries. Both of them were horrified, especially at early Christian forgeries, at the fact that early Christians had thought that the very enterprise of Jesus had needed to be promoted with lies. Here you see that in this consultation, they worked both with Christian and with Jewish texts in the same lines, in the same letters, and that the approach they took to both of them was the same. Cos Alban and Scaliger went into harder Jewish forgeries and pseudepigrapha as well. For as they studied Jews and Greeks together, Hellenic scholarship itself mutated. What the great Jewish scholar Azaria de Rossi noticed in the 1570s, what Scaliger realized in the 1580s and Cos Alban realized with him, was that tens of thousands of ancient Jews had used Greek as their primary language, had read their Bible in Greek, had written Greek. This fact had been forgotten in both the Jewish and the Christian traditions by the 15th century. The whole world of Hellenistic Judaism had been forgotten. Philo was still read, but he was treated as an honorary Christian. And otherwise, it was assumed that Jews had never used the languages of ancient culture. Scaliger and Cos Alban both realized that Greek texts by Jews formed part of the ancient heritage. Both of them were particularly interested in one of these, the letter of Aristeas to Philocrates. It's a marvelous text, probably written in the 2nd century BCE, though controversy attends that, as it does all other aspects of the text, which describes how the Alexandrian library asked the high priest in Jerusalem to send translators to Alexandria to make a proper version of the Pentateuch for the king's library. The high priest sends 72 translators, 6 from each of the 12 tribes. They banquet with the king in Alexandria and tell him all sorts of interesting things about Judaism. And then they translate the text, a task which coincidentally takes exactly 72 days and produces a splendid version of the Hebrew in Greek. Cos Alban, these are Cos Alban's reading notes on Aristeas. And here you see him saying, I don't think this book is as ancient as it claims it is, but it's still pretty ancient. And it's certainly the kind of book that I'm not ashamed to spend time reading, putting it in exactly the same category as he put the work of the Christian Hebraists. What's remarkable in this case is the contrast in the two men's approach to a text that still poses many difficult philological problems. Scaliger, when he came across inconsistencies and anachronisms, simply rejected the text that contained them. The letter of Aristeas, supposedly written in the 3rd century BE, described the Jews as still having 12 tribes. But most of those tribes had gone off into exile and never come back several centuries before. The text imagined Demetrius of Phalerum as the Alexandrian librarian who took care of the actual process of translation. Scaliger found that implausible, as Roger Bagnall has recently argued. It is implausible to charge him with that, though once again controversy rages over this. Scaliger rejected the text entirely. Moreover, he drew a moral from it. He argued that Hellenistic Jews were really not to be trusted as sources. They didn't know Hebrew. They invented stories about Hebrew, as Philo had invented stories about the meaning of Hebrew words. So for Scaliger, the single text was a diagnostic indication that the larger Greek literature of Jewish Hellenism really presented more a problem than a resource to the scholar. Cos Alban had read Scaliger and discussed Aristeas with him, but he takes a different approach to the text, as you can see. He doesn't think it's genuine. But as he reads it, he finds elements that seem to him to reflect genuine antiquity. A reference to ephemerides of the kings of Egypt, for example, sparks a remark about the official diaries of Alexander the Great and his successors. What interested him particularly was the fact that the Jews described by Aristeas washed their hands before they discussed the Torah. In the Gospels, as you'll remember, Pontius Pilate washes his hands. Cos Alban, 20 years before he read Aristeas, had argued that Pilate must have been carrying out a Jewish ritual, since he couldn't find any evidence that washing hands was a purificatory or apotropaic ritual in Greece or in Rome. Here in Aristeas, he found Jewish evidence, as he thought, imperfectly preserved, but still clearly somehow Jewish evidence to confirm his reading of the biblical account. For Cos Alban, therefore, the text, though of problematic authorship, was not to be rejected, but to be sifted for its historical information. In this case, Cos Alban's analysis of the text achieved something that no philologist among you will ever manage to do more than once or twice in a lifetime. He convinced Scaliger, who in his last approach to the text remarks on the washing of hands and the fact that Cos Alban had shown this to be a genuinely Jewish ritual. It's very rare in the world of my humanists for one to convince another of a technical point. I fear it may still be rare in the world of humanism. Most central here, as I hope is clear, is what's happening to Hellenism as the two men work on it. Greek literature is becoming something much more complicated than the product of a single civilization. It's becoming the product of multiple civilizations, as in fact it was, historically striated, full of texts of different value, texts that present problems, some of which are incredibly difficult and some literally insoluble. This isn't the direct discovery of an ancient world seen in all its proportions and colors, but the discovery of an ancient world too complicated to be seen and understood that way. And it's precisely the points at which Jewish and classical sources and problems intersect where the particularity of that discovery is most visible. The most important Greek text for Scaliger and Cos Alban was, of course, the New Testament. Immeasurably more important than anything we would call classical or Mark Patterson would call classical. Mark Patterson, Church of England clergyman, bitterly complained that Cos Alban preferred bastard Christian Greek to the true Greek of the 4th and 5th centuries BC. Cos Alban and Scaliger wouldn't have understood the criticism. They were as dedicated to the Greek of Josephus as they were to the Hebrew of the medieval Hebrew translation of Josephus, the Yosepon. And above all else, they were dedicated to understanding the Greek of the New Testament. And at the ends of their lives, both of them found that they had to work with Hebrew sources and even work with Jewish informants if they were to understand that Greek text in all its fullness. In 1613, Cos Alban went to the Bodleian Library at Oxford to continue his project of working on his attack on Baronio. Here are some of the notes that he took there. He really loved the Bodleian Library, as we all must. It is a magnificent institution, architecturally beautiful, stocked with wonderful books. It was also the first library in the modern world to have an acquisitions budget, though unfortunately Bodley, who endowed it, underestimated how much would be necessary, and the endowment was soon exhausted. And it was the first library to have a donor's book, where everyone after Bodley who gave books to the library found his name celebrated. Above all, it was the first library to refuse to let its treasures circulate. Normally, Renaissance libraries allowed you to borrow books. The Vatican let you borrow manuscripts. You had to wrap the chain that was supposed to hold them to their desk around them so you'd remember that they weren't your manuscripts and bring them back. If you forgot, you might receive an angry recall letter from the Pope. It happened more than once. Nonetheless, the principle was clear. Libraries were generally open very short hours. Most serious scholarly work was done outside them. The Bodleian, by contrast, was a non-circulating library, open 6 or 7 hours a day. And so, as Cos Alban noted, one not only learned a great deal there, but met every serious scholar in Oxford. One of them was particularly serious, a young Jew from Italy named Jacob Barnett, who lived in Oxford in the early 16 teens, teaching boys who were going to be ministers Hebrew and helping the professor of Hebrew with his studies. Cos Alban had a particular problem from which he needed help from Jewish law. After the opening up of the catacombs in 1578, Baronio had argued that the catacombs represented a new kind of Christian burial, and that this kind of Christian burial had actually begun with the burial of Jesus as described in the Synoptic Gospels, that there was, in other words, a new way of interring the dead as well as a new way of worship in Christianity. Cos Alban didn't believe this. He was certain that the burial of Jesus in the Gospels was a Jewish burial. He consulted Jacob. Jacob took Cos Alban. This is the first time that we can see a Christian do this, surfing in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Bava Batra. He found Cos Alban a passage on the law of burial, particularly the law of the niches or kochim in which Jews were buried. Cos Alban took down what Jacob told him, his hands trembling with excitement, and used it in magnificent passages of his attack on Baronio to show that Jesus was buried as a Jew. Scaliger came to see the New Testament as permeated not only with descriptions of Pharisees and Sadducees, but actually permeated with Pharisaic and Sadduceic beliefs, which Jesus often espoused. He found Jesus and the disciples often to be quoting what he learned from his Jewish informant, Philip Ferdinand, and this is a Hebrew book that belonged to Philip Ferdinand, a convert who taught Arabic in Leiden and read the Talmud with Scaliger. What Ferdinand showed him were proverbs and sayings to be found in the Talmud. So both Cos Alban and Scaliger, at the end of their lives, found themselves reading Jewish legal sources, sources too difficult for them, which they had to work through with the help of Jewish informants, in order, so they said, to explicate the most important of Greek texts, the founding texts of Protestant Christianity, the Greek texts of the New Testament. What did this actually mean? It meant that Scaliger and Cos Alban had come to see Christianity itself in its early centuries as permeated with Judaism, as a religion that arose in a Jewish world and that had retained for decades and centuries Jewish practices and Jewish customs. Scaliger was actually inspired to learn this by an unlearned Jew, a Jewish woman that he met in Avignon as a young man. He ate with her at meals. She was willing to eat fish with him. And they talked about all sorts of matters. At one point, she told him a joke about why the local rabbi was so stupid. This is a very common form of Jewish humor. And what she explained was that the Jews of Avignon, who were of course under papal control in the 14th century, hadn't wanted talented young men to run the risk of attracting attention from the papacy. So they had sent them all away and made the stupidest male Jew in Avignon, who had been properly circumcised, their rabbi, so that if he attracted papal attention, no harm would come to the community. Scaliger laughed, whereupon the Jewish woman said, "Don't laugh, sir. Your Jesus was a circumcised Jew too." From that moment on, as Scaliger told the students who sat in his garden in Leiden, and there you see him sitting in his garden with the students, from that moment on, he became intensely conscious of Jewish elements in early Christianity. Cos Alban seems to have imbibed this interest from Scaliger, but he felt it equally strongly. Partly, of course, it was a historical tool. To see Christianity in its first decades as Jewish was to see it as not Catholic. Baronio, for example, explained what Jesus called the apostles. You all know, of course, what the Virgin Mary reads. She's a well-brought-up girl, so what does she read? She reads the life of the Virgin Mary. Baronio asked himself, what did Jesus call the apostles? Well, they were apostles, so of course he called them apostles. Cos Alban asked Jacob Barnett what Jesus would have called his apostles, and Jacob came up with a good Aramaic word, sheliach, and said that's what he would have called them, a Jewish word for the apostles. It's a remarkable thing for a 16th century Protestant to be weighing in his mind. It was Scaliger who went furthest with Cos Alban's complete approval. Scaliger argued that the Last Supper itself was only a partial account of what had taken place at Jesus' last meetings with his sheliachim. Jesus had not only said the words of institution for the bread and wine, he had also celebrated a Passover Seder with his apostles. So, said Scaliger, we must reconstruct the Passover Seder if we're going to understand exactly what happened at this critical moment in the life of our Savior. So we must read a Haggadah, the liturgy of the Passover Seder. When we do that, however, Scaliger noted, applying to a Jewish source the same method he applied to Greek ones, we see that this is a text that took shape after the fall of the temple and thus after the life of Jesus. So we must subject the Haggadah itself to a historical analysis, identify those elements like the prayer to all to come and eat bread, which might come from before the fall of the temple, and that will give us the key to what Jesus did with his disciples. It's one of the most elaborate, subtle, and daring historical reconstructions offered by any scholar in the 16th century. Word ran around the Protestant networks immediately. You can find letters from Protestant to Protestant, not just theologians, but jurists and classical scholars saying, have you read what Scaliger says about the Passover and the Last Supper? Cos Alban merely noted on the copy of one of his copies of on the cover of one of his copies of Scaliger's book, note the aurea diatriba, the golden treatment of Passover and Easter in Scaliger's book. So this was a point in which they had come together. What did this mean? It meant that Christianity itself was not to be understood away from a Jewish context, That meant that the Greek of Christianity might be Jewish Greek, an argument that was pursued by Scaliger's disciples and others through the rest of the 17th and 18th century. That meant, so Scaliger told the boys sitting in his garden, that certain Jewish rituals had survived into early Christianity, and, said Scaliger, it was right to keep them. I wish we had kept them even now. It meant, finally, that scholarship, serious scholarship, had to involve not just reading, but dialogue with the Jews, who were, after all, the only profound guardians of their own tradition. And dialogue had its own dangers. After Jacob Barnett studied with Cos Alban, he went back to Oxford, and the Oxford authorities decided that it was time for him to convert to Christianity. They wrote to Cos Alban to say they were going to convert him to Christianity, and asked Cos Alban how to do that. Since there were almost no Jews in England, adult baptism was illegal, nobody actually knew how to convert a Jew. Cos Alban wrote back, I think he's really Jewish. I don't think you should convert him at all. Nonetheless, the conversion was planned for the first Sunday of term in St. Mary's Church in Oxford. And on the first Saturday of term, the authorities went to find Jacob Barnett and discovered that he had run away. They went after him on horse and foot. Universities had police in the good old days. They put him in Bocardo. Universities had jails in the good old days. And they subjected him to long and brutal questioning and interrogation and threats in the hope of making him finally agree to become a Christian. When Cos Alban heard of this, he was horrified. He was sad that Jacob hadn't really wanted to convert, but he was horrified to see a scholar treated this way, simply because he didn't want to convert. And he wrote a letter to a prelate above him in the order of dignities to go in turn to King James, who was Cos Alban's patron. And King James indeed sent his man with a writ to take Jacob Barnett out of jail in Oxford, put him on a boat in Dover. I'm happy to say he next turns up at the French court in Paris as the French monarchy's expert on Jewish affairs. He was clearly a man of parts. So the web of reading, the web of annotation stretched from antiquity to modernity, stretched out of the books to human contacts. Scaliger's web did too, though Scaliger had no such unhappy experiences, merely happy ones as he walked the streets of the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, where Portuguese Jews had been admitted, admiring the Jewish women sitting outside their houses on the Sabbath and observing the Sabbath, and telling his students, it's wonderful that the estates have readmitted the Jews. Jews are fantastic. They make a lot of money for us, and they teach us things about Hebrew. At this point, perhaps it's clear that any thought that Scaliger and Cos Alban were Hellenists in that neoclassical way that one used to think of them is completely false. Their vision of antiquity was complex, striated, multicultural. Their antiquity became, if anything, harder to judge and decipher and reconstruct and visualize over time rather than easier, and was, I would argue, on that account all the more remarkable as an achievement of scholarly technique and human empathy. I offer this little story as a tribute to a department of the study of the ancient world, which perhaps more than any other in this country also seeks, as I see it from afar, not to approach the ancient world as a simple thing that can be seen and judged and laid out in all its dimensions and colors, but as it should be, as a world that is eternally fascinating, that becomes not less but more puzzling as we know it better. Thank you very much.